Justin.
Okay. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Do you have me on the agenda at 9:10, or is that just a recording?
Well, Tim's gonna be presenting, but.
Tim's presenting,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
uh, But you're welcome. You can be anywhere you want.
Oh, no, that's good. I saw, I was looking at that other one you had.
Oh, no, that's the minutes from last time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, get out of your hair. Call her Navy thing.
All right.
Kelly joining on too?
Is who?
Kelly joining by video too?
Yes, Kelly should be here. Yeah. Tim, I'm just gonna practice sharing here real quick to make sure that I can get this right.
That is the presenter view, not the presentation view.
All right, how about now?
Nope. If you go to display settings, swap screens. Yeah.
So I don't know that I want to do that because then in the room, they're gonna see that.
Yeah, you gotta switch displays that you're sharing then, right?
You share, I wanna like share screen too. Then I want this up here. Okay, so now you can see the slides plus the people, right?
Correct.
Well, that's just gonna have to be how it is. Well, let me try one more thing here. So, new share. And what if I share this? So, so now do you see just the cover slide, not the Zoom video folks that I've got up on the main screen for people in the room?
Yeah, all I see is the title slide. If you click the next slide, I assume it'll just change. Groundwater development primer, key groundwater concepts.
Yep, that's it.
Your spring picture.
Picture.
So everything is good except for whatever reason, when I launched the meeting, she had it set to go live immediately.
Oh, okay.
So we're live.
So we're live, okay, but not live, but not recording. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay, that's fine.
I'll start the recording whenever you tell me to.
Cool.
Right now, you are the only co-host. Is there anyone else?
Tim, are you planning to stay for the whole thing?
Yep.
Make Tim.
Yeah,
Alright.
we'll add you as a co-host, in case, I don't know, you need to futz with the dials for somebody not muted and eating chips or something. Thank you.
All right.
All right, thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Okay, well, welcome, folks. It's 9 o'clock and we've got a quorum, so I think we should probably get started and folks will, I suspect, continue to enter, and that's great. So I sent out the agenda, well, here. Thank you, Grant, that's great. Meeting's being recorded, so that's good. Get a thumbs up from folks, making sure you can hear us in the room. Not talking to myself, okay, or to two people. Sounds great. So, again, agenda was emailed out, also, available online, so folks can follow along there. First item we have is introductions, and so, I'd like to start with the Groundwater Advisory Committee members that we've got. And let's start in the room with Richard.
Richard Smith, live in the Cooper Mountain Critical Groundwater area outside Beaverton, grouchy old farmer, really concerned with, domestic wells.
Right, and then I'm gonna open up my participants list here and I'll just go down the list and call on folks to keep us organized here. So let's start with Phil.
Bill Brown. I'm a consulting hydrogeologist. I'm from Beaver Creek.
And Brandon.
I'm Brandon Brown, water well developing out of Umatilla, Oregon. Water well contractor.
And Lance.
Hey, good morning. My name is Lance Lindo. I'm a drinking water regulator here for Klamath County, and I have a little bit of background in hydrology as well over the years. It's good to be with you folks.
Brent.
Yeah, I'm Trent Kastner. I'm with Cascade Drilling, where I represent the environmental monitoring well portion of Oregon Department of Water Resources, licensed driller.
And Zach.
Yeah, good morning. Good to see y'all. I'm Zach Fried. I'm a hydrologist out of Bend, Oregon. I lead the Nature Conservancy sustainable water portfolio of projects across the state.
Okay, and any groundwater advisory committee folks that I missed? All right, perfect. I think I will ask WRD staff to just introduce themselves when they come up on the agenda. Also acknowledge we got some public members, so that's great. Thanks for joining us. We've got a public comment period down near the bottom of the agenda, but likely we'll make space as we go through the major updates here to take any public comment that might be related to those agenda items. Usually works out well as long as we've got plenty of time. We are scheduled to run until noon today, that we might end earlier if that's too much time for as much discussion as might occur. And with that, this being our first meeting of 2024, first of all, want to say welcome to Lance and Zach, who are joining us as new members of the committee. Welcome back to Richard, who's starting his second term. And welcome back to everybody else that's in the middle of your current terms. Appreciate your time here. First meeting, we typically select a chair and a co-chair for the year. Phil is our returning past chair, I guess, from 2023. And be happy to take volunteers or nominees from the committee for who wants to chair for 2024? And we also have a co-chair for when the chair is not able to be with us to step in. So the chair first. Anybody?
I nominate Phil.
Thank you, Richard. I don't mind doing it. It's fine. But if anybody else would like to take over and step in, that's perfectly fine as well with me. For me, just as a heads up, I saw 2 conflicts on my calendar for the later meeting. So a co-chair is definitely going to be necessary. I've got some travel later in the year. So we're going to need somebody to step in, I think, at least once and maybe twice.
All right. I don't know that this is such a formal thing that we need to vote on it, but let's just say that Richard motioned and Phil seconded for himself. Everybody in favor? Say yay or give me a thumbs up.
Yay.
All right. Anybody opposed? All right. Congratulations, Phil. Hey, I'll also say this is Phil's last year on the committee, coming into his 6th year. So again, appreciate his and everybody else's time, but also would be good to have a co-chair that will be here for a few more years going forward. So opening up nominations or volunteers for co-chair.
I certainly don't mind acting as co-chair. Be good to learn from Phil for at least a couple of these meetings before I am tossed into that role, but happy to do it if nobody else wants to.
Then I nominate you, Zach.
All right, so Zach's.
And I second that.
All right, Zach's nominated by Phil and seconded. Trent gives the thumbs up. Awesome. Anybody, well, how about this? All in favor?
Aye.
And anybody
Aye.
opposed? All right, perfect. We'll call that unanimous. So thank you.
Thank you,
Phil and
Zach.
And so I guess, Phil, do you have the agenda up in front of you? You want to take it from there, or I'm happy to assist? Yep.
That brings us to agenda item C, approval of the November 2023 meeting summary. And I'm going to be honest, I don't recall seeing the November meeting summary.
Okay, yeah, I hope that I sent that out to the committee members with the draft agenda earlier, but here it is. It's short and sweet, 1 page. Reminder that the recording didn't kick in until about halfway through, unfortunately. So our recording began mid-presentation on agenda item C, but we've got the timestamped links to where the recording begins, to the committee discussion, and to the public comment on both C and D listed there in the summary as usual.
I move we approve.
Well, I certainly don't. Go ahead.
I move we approve the abbreviated meeting summary.
Yeah, I'll second that. I don't see anything to object to there. Short and sweet.
Okay, perfect. Those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Anyone opposed? All right, we will take the draft stamp off that and post it to the website after the meeting today.
Moving along, we are at agenda item D for the start card fee update. And looking to hear from Jennifer Brown.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. I'll just wait till we get the presentation up. There it is. So I'm Jennifer Brown. I'm an accountant in the administrative Administrative Services Division, and I'm here to present the Start Card report, and this has numbers updated through December of 2023. When we reported back in September, the numbers were as of June, and so there's a few changes, but a lot of it might seem familiar if you were at that meeting in September. So we can go on to the next slide. This slide shows us the historical rates we've charged for Start Card. And currently we're charging the $350 per Start Card, which was implemented with House Bill 2145, effective January 1st, 2022. You can just kind of see how that fee amount has grown over the years. We can move on to the next slide. This ORS 537-762 subsection 13 defines for us where we're allowed to use our Start Card fees that we receive. And it states that the Water Resources Department needs to go in the operating fund, and that the costs are to employ personnel to inspect wells and well construction as well. Next slide. Further, in the statute, ORS 537-763 subsection 4 defines for us within the fees received where we're allowed to allocate and spend those funds. For administrative purposes, we're not allowed to spend more than 5%. For technical, we're not allowed to spend more than 20%. And then with a majority of those fees going to fund their field and enforcement, which is not less than 75% allocated towards that. This slide shows us a comparison of our last biennium to our current biennium projections on the total revenues, and the Start Card fees are reported in the second line where you see including fees, other funds including fees. You can see year over or biennium over biennium, it's pretty comparable in what we expect and what we did receive. Next slide. Next slide, sorry.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so within that second line under other fees, it was about $19 million. Within that number, these are power and water fees projections for the current biennium, just over $12 million in total. You'll see Start Card up here at 2.17 million is what we are projecting. It makes up about 1% of the total fee budget. And I'm sorry, excuse me, 4.5% of the total fee budget, 1% of our total budget is what Start Card represents. In case you're curious, you know, on the previous slide, we reported 19 million. We're only showing 12 million here. The difference there is revenues from gauging agreements, shared service agreements, assistant water master agreements, our WRF funds, and plant-based water planning. So that's what kind of makes up that gap. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. This slide shows us our historic count of Start Cards over quite a few years here. You can see that the average, well, you can't see this, but I'll just say the average, like 5-year average, has been 3,500 per year. The current year, or for the current biennium, we're projecting 3,100 Start Cards per year. We came up with these counts based on dividing the total number of Start Cards by the fees at the time. And so you can see there was a large jump. For instance, sorry, that might be on the next slide. Apologize. Basically, we we got this information by the fee at the given time. And so that's why there may be lower amounts, but in some years, the amounts may have been the same. All right. Oh, and can we go back to that slide? I wanted to point something out. You can see in the blue, that's monitor wells. In the orange, that's water wells. Monitor wells have remained pretty steady, whereas you can see the water wells have kind of fluctuated from year to year. Okay. And this slide shows us the revenues, the fees that we've brought in on start cards. This is what I was trying to point out in the last slide, but it was pertaining to this slide, so I apologize for that. There's a large jump in fees brought in between the 1921 biennium and the 21-23 biennium, and that is related to House Bill 2145, where we increase those fees quite a bit. So just wanted to point that out. We're anticipating, like I said, revenues of 2.17 million in the current biennium, which equates to about 3,100 start cards per year of that biennium. Okay, next slide. These are the start card expenditures over the last 8 bienniums. It identifies the percentage on how we're spending the funding, as noted in the previous slide on how we're allowed to, per the statute, allocate the funds. You can see that in the blue, that's admin, which in all years has been 5% or lower, excuse me, all bienniums. And then technical, we have the ability to spend 20% or less in that area. And so we see that in the green. And then the red is where we've spent it on field and enforcement, which must be 75% or more. Note that all of these bienniums, we have been in compliance with the statute within the percentages allowed for us to spend these funds. And that next slide, please. This slide shows us the change in fund balance from the beginning of this biennium to what we project the ending fund balance to be when it's all said and done in June 2025. Think of this as like a checking account for start cards, where deposits are going in. These are your revenues, and then expenditures, you're writing checks out of it. We would like to note that we do anticipate about at this moment a reduction in fund balance, about $250,000, and this is really related. A lot of it's related to the changes in personnel costs related to the contract negotiations and for salary increases and benefit increases, as well as inflationary implications on factors impacting the buying of supplies and such. And so we just want to note that. We'd like to note that we do anticipate a further reduction moving into the 25-27 biennium in this area based on what the fees are now, as revenues are pretty much expected to stay the same, while expenditures are anticipated to increase as inflation impacts us and just costs of everything go up. So that's that. Okay, moving on. Like I said, the start card revenue is less than 1% of the overall budget. Within the expenditures, I'd note that start card does fund 15 positions, not all full-time, some are part-time. It equates to 9.87 FTEs. And this is revenue dependent on it when how we fund these positions and have these positions onboarded. And then start cards are projected to be we're to bring in 3,100 annually for this biennium. So now we're going to, even though it's called the start card report, we want to report out some other areas of fees that we are bringing in fees for. Our groundwater use recording revenue. This is a $300 fee. It's required to be submitted along with a map showing the exact location of the tax lot within 30 days after a well is installed, a well is completed. No, and House Bill 2145 impacted this fee as well by changing how we collect the fee or who we collect the fee from. It was formerly the landowner. And then January 1, 2022, it moved to the driller. And so that's just a note on that. In the 21-23 biennium, it was 1.77 million. And then in the projection for the current biennium is 1.5 million in fees anticipated. Okay. So our groundwater use recording expenditures, we made some changes in this area with House Bill 2145 as well. Let me just see if I get this right. Forgive me, I was not on board when this happened, so it's just me studying up on it. For budgetary purposes, we moved the hydrogeologist out of start card, seeing as how those funds were being depleted, and into this area is where we decided to fund that position. And that happened actually in the 2019-21 biennium. That was a temporary change, but then with House Bill 2145, we decided to make that a permanent change. At the same time, we decided to put the well program specialist over in start card. So it's kind of, they went they kind of flip-flop. So and just like see the projection on the increased expenditures in the current biennium, that's same impact with increased payroll and inflationary factors as well. All right. Next slide. This is our historic geotech revenue. These fees have been collected since 2009. The fee is $25 for the first hole and then $10 for each hole after. It's a lower amount we receive, much lower. We're projecting 125,000 in the current biennium, which is very comparable to where we were in this previous biennium. And we see a steady decline in the revenues. We're just, our well division's working on figuring out what is causing that, why this program just seems to just decline, and what is how we can improve the communication and improve that. So, okay. And then the expenditures, unfortunately, look they're going the opposite way, with revenues declining and expenditures going up. That seems to be the theme of where we're at right now in all areas. But I wanted to note that in the 21-23 biennium, there were vacancies in this area position wise. And so this current biennium, this is projecting that basically all vacancies are filled. We're fully spending as we've projected, and that could change. Obviously, it's just an estimate. But okay, next slide. That's it. Unless there's questions.
I don't have any questions, but I do think it's interesting. I mean, I know that, for instance, the monitoring wells, we characterize that as a fairly stable number, but it also looked like if you put a trend line on the whole data set, you'd probably get a slight declining trend. So like monitoring wells, seems like there's, over the whole period of record on a chart, there's probably a declining trend on those, and recently declining trend on geotech wells.
Yeah,
Sort of an interesting thing to note. I don't know if that has any economic
correlate.
implications.
Oh, yeah.
What that's a function of, that they both have that same trend. They're not maybe
Yeah.
there's less construction going on these last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, Phil, this is Trent Caster. I can definitely relate to that. That is, we've definitely seen a decline in both monitoring and some geotechnical work. But that also kind of correlates too with a decline in the amount of drillers doing the work too. So even though we're doing less work, or the drillers are busy. So it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any additional comments or questions for Jennifer on the Starkart fee update and the rest of the revenue and expense streams? If not, thank you very much, Jennifer.
Well, thank you. You made it easy on me. You guys have a great day.
Thanks, Jennifer.
You too. That brings us to agenda item E, the legislative update. Brent.
Morning, everybody. For those of you who I have not met, my name is Bryn Hudson. I'm the legislative coordinator for the Water Resources Department. Thank you for having me present to you all today. I'm going to be primarily discussing a debrief from the 2024 legislative session. It was a pretty quiet session from the water world. So I will be brief, and then I know this is not technically what's on the agenda, but we are in the midst of launching engagement efforts around 2025, 2027 budget and legislative development. And so I just wanted to highlight a few opportunities for engagement for those who might be interested there as well. We are presenting much of this information actually to our commission meeting in much greater detail this Thursday. So for those of you who want probably more information than you've ever wanted about the budget development process and queuing up department legislative concepts, I encourage you to listen into that update to our commission this week. So this will be a little bit of a taste. So in terms of 2024 short session, so as a reminder, we have two different types of legislative sessions in Oregon. During odd numbered years, we have what we lovingly call the long legislative session. That's often about 6 months long. That's when we're setting biennial budgets, doing big policy work. And then even number of years are what we call short sessions, which are about 5 weeks. Initially, they were not for large policy, but that has shifted a bit over in recent years. So depending on what the governor's priorities and the legislator's priorities are, big policy topics might often be tackled during the short session. But that being said, this session was really housing and infrastructure focused session, along with drug treatment and recriminalization work. So not a whole lot of water stuff per se. So I don't have too much for you. But essentially the session spanned from February 5th to March 7th. So it ran for about a month. There was about 250 bills that were introduced. We were tracking about 70 of them for a variety of reasons. But I'll just get to a few that may be of interest. I did forward our staff report for the commission over to Justin for you all to review. There is a full legislative summary of all of the bills that may be of interest, some of which may not, but I'll just highlight a few. And so there's, I think, 3 pieces of legislation I'll highlight. The first is Senate Bill 1567, which directed the department to implement the Walla Walla 2050 strategic plan, which is work that we are largely doing in consort with the Washington Department of Ecology and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And so really it's the most of the bill was just kind of codifying the effort in law and making sure that our partners understand that Oregon is committed to this work. However, there was a key piece of authority that was granted to state agencies in this bill that some of you may be interested in, and that piece was is that it gives state agencies the authority to actually spend money for projects that are located either wholly or partially in the state of Washington, provided that they, one, implement the Walla Walla 2050 strategic plan and have a positive benefit for Oregon's water resources, whether it be in stream, out of stream, surface groundwater. So there are some caveats that go along with that authority, but that is a new authority that was included in that bill. So that's a new development there on that work. Additionally, there was what we lovingly call the Christmas tree bill. So the end of session bill that usually it's a very long bill that a lot of stuff just kind of gets packed into. That is Senate Bill 5701. And so there's a lot of different pieces. I'll just pull out the two that are relevant to our agency. The first is that we received $1 million for our well abandonment repair and replacement fund. So that's a program that was established back in 2021. It was passed by the legislature and established. We have since, I believe, several months ago expended all of the resources within that account. And so this legislation recapitalized an extra $1 million in there for this biennium to spend on well abandonment repair and replacement, which is always exciting. We love to see that. This bill also had a technical fix for direct appropriation for the city of Sotaville that we received as pass-through dollars in 2023. So there's some of that. And then that technical fix also came with an additional $60,000 for water hauling expenses. So that work, just the long story short, is they need some rehabilitation work on their well. The way that the money was appropriated was not compatible with the use that the city actually needed. And so the legislature had to revisit that and fix it, essentially. And then that also allowed them to reappropriate some funds to pay for some water hauling expenses that were incurred over the last year or so. And then last, there's several bills, so I won't go into the bill numbers and all of the different pieces, but as I noted that infrastructure related to housing was a really big focus. And so what that ultimately culminated in was a series of direct appropriations to entities, primarily municipalities, but there were some appropriations to special districts for a variety of different projects. I will note that the connection to housing was appeared to be a prerequisite for a lot of these direct appropriations. And so there was over, about $100 million over the course of over several different bills that part of those direct appropriations. Water infrastructure, so things like sewers, conveyance systems, rehabilitation, stormwater treatment, water treatment. Water infrastructure for housing was a big focus. And so we saw a lot of projects essentially get funded that way. I will note that most of that money went to the Department of Administrative Services and Business Oregon. So WRD, I think out of all of the funding, we received $1.5 million for, so a very small amount for one project in particular. But other than that, those large dollar amounts went to DAS and Business Oregon to directly pass through to municipalities largely looking to make infrastructure upgrades, and water was a focus there. So that is really the meat of what happened in 2024. I will just note that we are turning our attention to 2025, and so we are in the process of we had our kickoff, our legislative and budget kickoff meeting last week on the 13th. So on Wednesday, March 13th. Our next meeting will be April 9th. The staff report that I sent to Justin has all this information for you. But essentially, we are hosting a series of public meetings to discuss potential legislative concepts as well as potential budget issues that we are facing to help kind of inform what that process might look like. And so I won't go into that since I only have 15 minutes slated, but the staff report will have a suite of legislative concepts that we are considering, and then budget issues that we will be discussing with our commission on Thursday. which we have not discussed budget with the broader stakeholder group. So legislative development has been really the focus of our public outreach and engagement. And just a high level overview for you all in terms of kind of the areas that we are considering legislation and budget. We are really focused on things that need attention right now that impact core agency functions and allow us to deliver better outcomes and customer service. So think of things like program sunset dates that need to be extended, revenue shortfalls that need to be addressed that support staff in critical divisions within our agency. Think those types of ideas. That is primarily what we are looking at from a legislative perspective. And you will also see that reflected in some of the budget issues that we are floating with our commission. And there's quite a bit of them. And so that's for those of you who haven't been involved in the budget process. We are often basically putting everything on the table, and then we pair it. So that's essentially kind of how we typically do it. But I will pause to see if there are any questions. I'm going to avoid getting into the specifics of 2025 development just because we've got a staff report and we'll be discussing it with our commission on Thursday, and there's no way to do that update quickly. So any questions or comments on either 2024 past legislative session or 2025 development?
Yeah, thank you for that, Bren. I've got a quick question for you. Going back to the well abandonment repair and replacement fund, I remember that fund had been fully spent down from the prior allocation of funds to it. How long do you think $1 million is going to last in that fund? And is there a way to secure a more stable revenue source rather than just going back to the legislature every couple biennia and asking for more?
Yeah, great question, Zach. So you are correct. The funding was spent down. The $1 million is a general fund appropriation. So theoretically, it will need to all be spent by the end of the biennium. I'd have to check and see if those funds roll over into other funds. I'd have to look at the legislative language to know if there's a rollover option. But as it stands, the fund is capped at 40 grand per applicant. So I'm not a math person. So you could do that 1 million divided by 40 in terms of how many folks could potentially, if they were to max out their grant request, could be served by this. We know that there is a need out there. We've received a lot of, unfortunately, folks reaching out to us asking about money when there is no money. So we anticipate that this funding will be used well. That is to say, in terms of a more stable funding source, we do have a budget. We have a budget item for this. So we treat it like all of our other funding programs where we do have to actually go back to the legislature and ask. I believe this is a general fund appropriation, so I need to look and see if there are any special circumstances because we have a mixture of funding programs that take lottery bond or general fund. And so I'd have to see exactly how the bill is written to know if it's a base budget appropriation that we just get it, or if we actually have to go back to the legislature and ask. But the reason for this funding being reappropriated is that the legislature did not reappropriate resources in 2023. Which was unfortunate. The legislature chose not to fund that budget item for us. And so legislators rallied around the idea of funding it again in the short session. So I, don't necessarily know if there's an easy answer for how we get more stable funding, but hopefully people will understand the benefits of the program and it becomes easier to secure resources for it.
Got it. Thank you. And I see Annette just chimed in the chat that 25 wells apiece at the maximum cap of the grant, and then more commonly 37 wells, which is great. It's really fantastic for those 25 to 37 households. And I want to support this, this fund more. But it feels like that might not be sufficient for, I think that the data might show that we have more than 25 to 37 households with wells going dry per biennium. So just wanted to point that out. Thank you, Brent.
Thanks, Zach.
I have a question on the same topic, but maybe it's for Justin and not Bren. So who's the average applicant for the $40,000 well? Are these wells that are needing repairs? Are they typically domestic wells, or are there municipal or agricultural wells found in the mix, and people are just getting some financial assistance for a much larger project?
Justin, I can tackle that one if you want.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a program directly, the statute specifically requires that it is a well used for household purposes. So we are looking at domestic wells under this program. So that is the primary recipient. When we received initial resources in 2021, there are a variety of uses that the funding under this program can be used for. In 2021, however, the legislature gave specific direction to focus on folks that are up to low to moderate income that have been impacted by drought or wildfire. So those have been the folks that have been the primary recipients of resources. So wildfire damage, or folks who have gone dry in particularly drought-prone areas are the primary folks that are getting resources from under the WRF.
Great.
Loving name, the WRF.
Where, how about like nitrate issues or anything like that? Is any of it being allocated for people with those problems?
So, great question. And that is an issue that we are currently kind of evaluating the applicability. So in 2023, the legislature actually added the authority for the fund to be able to, let me make sure I get this right, to fund repairs on wells that are experiencing above drinking water level contamination. And then they also granted us the authority to essentially evaluate whether or not well construction actually would help remediate that problem, right? So if it's just as simple of like drilling deeper into an already contaminated aquifer, that's maybe not a good use of resources. But you know, if it's a sealing issue or a commingling issue or whatever, the bill gives us a little bit of flexibility there. We currently do not have rules in place that kind of help parse out how we evaluate those types of applications, provided that we are not the water quality experts. And so to this point, we have not issued any funding. Well, we haven't had funding since we received that authority to actually spend money, but we are currently working with our partners at the Department of Environmental Quality as well as the Oregon Health Authority to actually figure out what spending on something like a water quality issue would actually look like, and what information we would need to essentially require to ensure that we are being responsible with those resources, provided that water quality in the ground is, it's a multifaceted, complicated issue. And we just want to make sure that we've fully kind of assessed how we handle those types of funding requests should we receive them in the future. But we do have the authority to address some of those problems.
Thank you.
That was good information. Thanks, Brent. Are there any other questions on that legislative update?
I have one other question, Brandon. This is a little bit out of left field, but since Brandon mentioned water quality, I figured I'd toss it out there. You know, I'm gonna get the number wrong, Senate Bill 1561 maybe is the Monsanto Settlement Fund that is primarily for water quality remediation, but the scope of the fund is pretty broad and can include actions that just maintain or restore or enhance water quality and quantity and things like that. I think it was like something close to $700 million, and 50% of the annual allocations go to a state agency sub-fund kind of thing. And I'm just curious if Water Resources Department has been thinking creatively about whether they they are in a position, you are in a position to be able to access some of that funding for some of the work that Water Resources does that's at the edge, at the margins between water quantity and water quality.
Yeah. Great. Sorry, I thought I was on mute. Great question, Zach. We have not been involved in those conversations, so I don't have a whole lot to offer on that. I know it's still, there was a good amount of money that I think largely went to OWEB, I want to say. And so I don't think that we have been too heavily engaged in any of those conversations at this point.
Okay. It might be worth checking in with OWEB on, because I think it's going to be a pretty significant source of revenue to state agencies moving forward. And although it's not a perfect fit for Water Resources Department, it might be a good enough fit for some of the Water Resources Department's programs. One last thing, sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot for this agenda item, but Bryn, your presentation was just really interesting, so spurred a lot of thoughts. You mentioned that in the 25 long session, you're thinking that most of the LCs that you're developing are related to core functions and making sure that program sunset dates are addressed and revenue shortfalls with core staff positions are addressed. You know, it feels to me like there's been this 2024 short session accepted. There's been a lot of movement and a lot of opportunity within the legislature for water in particular over the past 5 years or so. Don't you think that it might be beneficial or strategic to be more ambitious with the department's potential LCs as you're developing them, to include broader reaching possibilities than just the absolute key core functions?
Zach, I think that's a great comment. What I will say is we have a lot of new work on our plate. We received a lot of work from the 2021 legislative session, and that work did not, the hose did not stop in 2023. And what we have realized is scaling an agency where you have to hire over 100 new people, which is a massive effort, which I want to call out our HR department for just being rock stars there. You realize where the cracks are really quick, right? And while there was massive investment in the more flashy parts of the agency per se, when you think of like the science and the field and, you know, the policy work, like there's lots of investment there. There was not a lot of investment on kind of the foundational systems within our agency that support all of that work. And so what happened is we got all of this great new exciting stuff to do, and it created this like reverse pyramid, right? Where you have the core foundational stuff on the bottom that is really sparse, and it's trying to support this really technically rich, dense other work, and the systems just aren't there. And to us, I think I would maybe spin a little bit of what you said. For us right now, the strategic thing is to ensure that we've got core IT systems in place that actually support the data that communities need, that we need to manage the resource. Ensuring that we are being thoughtful with our communication and having capacity within our agency to be equitable in our communication and delivery of our services. If we have shortfalls in our dam safety program or our water rights program, we can't issue water rights quickly or timely, which I know many of you have been watching those issues know that we're struggling with that. We've got backlogs. There are core pieces of our agency that have, I shouldn't say that have been forgotten, but need attention. And any of you who have been around a long time know that any kind of conversation around budget shortfalls and fee revenues are really, really hard. We don't like having those conversations. Fee payers don't like having those conversations, and they take a lot of bandwidth to actually move through the building. And so we are limited in the number of bills that we can actually run at a given time. And so we have to prioritize. And the tightrope walk that we are doing is we have to have a functional dam safety program. We have to have a functional water right transactions program. We have to have a functional well construction program. And if we don't have those, it doesn't make sense to pursue more ambitious policy or other projects when we're leaving existing programs behind. And so that's kind of the balancing trade-off analysis that we're essentially doing. And one of the key one of the key items and priorities for this governor administration is key outcomes and customer service. And for us, addressing those programs are front and center in delivering better customer service and enhancing outcomes. So I know that's probably not exactly what you wanted to hear, but that's kind of what our thought process has really been. And we'll talk with the commission about it more in depth if you are interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I didn't want to hear anything. Brendan, your answer was great. I wanted to hear your answer, and that was helpful.
You know, you mentioned HR and staffing, and you know, there has been a lot of emphasis on getting staff levels up to balance with the workload over the last couple of years. Is the department still adding positions, and how are things going with getting the open positions filled? Are we a lot closer or a little closer?
That's a great question. I don't know if Lisa Snyder is on. I don't want to put her on the spot. I know that the director's report for our commission on Thursday may have an update on where we're at on staffing. And so I can look at that staff report. We're always hiring folks, whether it's new positions or people moving horizontally within the agency or vertically within the agency, right? You get a new position, someone internal might apply for it, and then you got to fill their position. So it's kind of like a staffing Tetris. I can pull that staff report and see if I can find that information for you, but we are always hiring folks. It just kind of depends on what's open and what's been filled at this point in time.
Brian, I might just add that I think we're somewhere around 30 vacancies right now that we still need to fill.
Just from using my bad memory, I mean, that's significant progress over what it was, I think, about 18 months ago.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else for Brent? Well, thank you. Great presentation. A lot of information there. And that brings us to agenda item F, an update on the Harney Basin groundwater situation from Justin.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. And actually, I got a change in the agenda. I had my name in there because I had confirmed with Tim that he was available, but Tim Seymour will be giving this update, so I'll pass it over to him.
Thanks, Justin. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section. And I am one of the collaborators on the Division 512 rulemaking process, where we're going through to update the rules around the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. The bulk of that work, though, is focused specifically on Harney Subbasin within that administrative basin, and focused on designating a critical groundwater area. So today I want to bring all of you up to speed on what we've been talking about with the rulemaking advisory committee there. We are coming up on our 1-year anniversary of that process and have been meeting with the RAC since April 25th of last year. And a lot of good conversations have happened. We've had 6 total RAC meetings. And in those, we've talked about a variety of different topics, really presenting science and process, and are now getting to actually drafting rules that take that science and all of those conversations we've had and starting to put them into policy on the books. I do believe we have a couple of our groundwater advisory committee members who are also rules advisory committee members for this process. And I believe that's Zach and Ken Bentz. And they have both been extremely helpful in that process as we go through it. So today I'm going to present a ton of information. Please stop me, pop up a hand, ask questions as we go. But I'm going to try to get through this in a timely fashion as well. So I'm going to talk about first how we started to delineate boundaries, then how we went through criteria for prioritizing which sub areas within the critical area are of high priority, and where we want to focus our efforts. Then I want to talk about calculating the permissible total withdrawal, the PTW, that's how much water can be pumped within an area. We'll talk about what the actual proposed PTW numbers are. And then I'll just give a list of some of the continuing conversations that we're planning on having with the RAC. So to start out with, we have to know where we're going to focus our efforts here related to the critical groundwater area. And so our proposal here is to set the critical groundwater area exterior boundary the same as the current Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern boundary. Few reasons for that. It's currently classified. It's an established administrative boundary. It's already in existence. And it includes the vast majority of groundwater use within the basin. And when I say vast, I mean it's something like 99+% of groundwater use. And it includes all of the areas with significant decline and excludes areas without significant decline. So as you can see here in this map, the orange is the Harney Basin. The dark black line is the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. So when we say we're updating the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin rules, that black area is the administrative basin, and that's the focus there. And then the GIVGAC and also the proposed critical groundwater area boundary is in purple there. So you can see how much of the Harney Basin we're focusing on there. So after designating the exterior boundary, we've started to look at a need for subareas within the critical groundwater area. So subareas are really needed for effective implementation of corrective controls. So if we're going to take action, we want that action to be timely and efficient and effective within those areas. So the goal here is to group areas of the basin together where pumping impacts are similar and well behavior is similar, so that we can, when reducing pumping, provide relief in those areas with the most severe declines. And then subareas also allow for facilitation of voluntary actions. So if groundwater users want to get together to voluntarily reduce pumping, they can do that through a voluntary agreement. And it's helpful for users to be grouped together where their changes will have collective impact. Also, generally, fewer people that have to be party to an agreement makes agreement more likely. So those are some of the key reasons for subareas. So then we put together a proposal for the criteria for subarea delineation, right? So how are we going to decide, where to draw these lines within this map? And here are the three primary criteria we've gone with. The first one is hydraulic gradient, which is, the driving force of groundwater flow. The second one was groundwater level trends. So, looking at what's going on within wells and both from a seasonal and a long-term response to pumping stresses. And then the last being subsurface materials. So what can the geology tell us about these areas, and if there are specific features that act as good boundary lines for delineation of a subarea. So these are the three primary criteria. This is the bulk of what we used. A couple of other considerations that we've included are we are designating lines based on PLSS section lines, right? So the public land survey system, most property follows a PLSS section line or similar. So it makes it easy and straightforward for landowners to understand where the boundary line falls. And the last thing was locations of groundwater points of appropriation and places of use. So trying to understand where we do have lines, it may make sense to adjust a boundary to pull in a point of appropriation to one subarea so that it's included with the rest of the points of appropriation or whatever that place of use may be. So that was an additional consideration. But by far and away, these three here on the screen are the primary criteria for delineation of those boundaries. So here's what the proposed map looks like. In the dark red on this map, the dark red line going around the outside, that's the boundary there. And then within each, you can see the different sub areas in the different colors here, with 15 total proposed sub areas. And I've got them listed out here as well. So that's the proposal. We do have an online interactive map that you can get to if you want to take a look at these sub areas. All of the boundaries, really, we have a ton of layers built into that map, including other information I'm going to show here in this presentation related to groundwater level trends, as well as information from the Harney Basin Groundwater Study, in which we created contour maps, etc. So all that information is available in that mapper for you all, as well as any members of the public, and especially the Rules Advisory Committee, to be able to visualize and see the data that we've been using and discussing as we've gone through this process. So after delineating the boundaries there, we then started to look at, what are our criteria for prioritizing action within the critical groundwater area subareas, right? So where are our groundwater level decline rates the highest? Where is the total groundwater level decline magnitude the highest? And then we've also considered a couple of other criteria here that we've gotten feedback on, and we haven't come to a complete decision there on if we want to use this 40, 80 feet above mean sea level criteria or not. That 40, 80 feet is I call it the historic bottom of the Harney Lake, which is generally the bottom of the basin, since it's a closed basin. So that's where groundwater flow is headed all across this basin. And the thought being that if 4080 stops being the lowest point in the basin, we're starting to see a reversal of groundwater flow direction. And then the last one here is that a well-defined groundwater level cone of depression dominates the subarea. So that helps us better understand exactly, where pumping has coalesced together to change, again, that historic flow of groundwater throughout the basin. So those are the criteria we've used, and then I'll start to get into some of the information here and data that supports that. So here I'm showing groundwater level decline magnitudes. Note that when it says minimum, that's the number of feet it has declined. So this would be like the largest amount of decline, even though we're using the term minimum here, and maximum would be anything above zero or the least amount of decline, right? So not above zero necessarily, but it's the least amount. So as you can see here, we've got in the Weaver Springs subarea from a magnitude perspective, we've reached 116.9 feet of decline as our highest or largest amount of decline observed. But then you can see the median and the averages here for these subareas, and we have a substantial amount of decline across these subareas. And as I said before, in that interactive mapper, we also have this layer published, so you can actually drill in and see what these wells are and really start to figure out, where we have the largest amounts of decline from a magnitude perspective. And then same thing again here with the decline rates. We published this as well, but you can see, again, minimum rate is the amount of decline. So a bigger minimum rate equals more decline, smaller rate equals less decline. But when we look at these average and median rates here, we've got substantial rates of decline with, an average rate in the Weaver Springs subarea of almost 6 feet per year. Rock Creek, we're looking at 4.5 feet per year. And with some of these largest levels of decline being in the double digits and as high as 22 feet per year. So clearly very obvious significant declines. And so again, another reason for our prioritization. Let me check the chat here really quick because I see some things came through. Thanks for dropping that link into the chat, Justin. So then we went through and using these criteria began to prioritize the sub areas, and we came up with 6 high priority sub areas. These again are based primarily on rate and magnitude of decline. But then we also looked at that, those clearly defined cones of depression. And when you look at the interactive mapper, you can see, especially when you look at contour maps, you can see the Weaver Springs, the Dog Mountain, Lawn, Crane, and North Harney and Rock Creek. The smaller sub areas are clearly dominated by cones of depression, and they have those high rates of decline and large magnitudes of decline. So those are our 6 high priority sub areas where we want to really focus our efforts related to reduction of pumpage, so curtailment, as well as doing that quickly and effectively. And then lower priority sub areas, we've got 9 of those. And these are areas where we are going to focus on reducing use, but not with the same tactics for curtailing use. So now that we've delineated the boundaries, we've started to prioritize where we're going to take action. We then have to calculate a permissible total withdrawal. So, and I've got a typo here. This is a 537, not 547. So I'll fix that. So ORS 537, 735, 3B uses this term, permissible total withdrawal. And then we've defined it or continued to use it throughout our Division 10 rule language there in OAR 690-10. And basically it means the total amount of groundwater that's allowed to be pumped within a critical groundwater area, sub-area annually. So we measure that in acre feet per year. Essentially it's a volumetric number to which we're going to limit groundwater pumping. And the goal is to reach a point where we have reasonably stable groundwater levels. And for this project, we have said that our goal is to halt groundwater declines. So we want groundwater levels to stabilize. And so what we have to do is come up with a permissible total withdrawal, or a PTW, that achieves that. So how do we do that? Talking about determining the PTW, we've broken up the way in which we're going to do that by high priority sub areas and lower priority sub areas. So within the higher priority sub areas, we really want to start to figure out when did declines begin. And so we're going to use what we're calling the hydrograph approach. And we'll talk through that here in a second. The goal is to determine when declines began, and then we can determine what pumpage was prior to that point when declines began, because pumpage that occurred before that point where declines began was resulting in stable groundwater levels. And so pumpage prior to that point would be a value that can occur without groundwater levels continuing or beginning to decline or continuing to decline as they are now. And so then we would set that PTW to that pumpage prior to declines. So that's for the high priority sub areas. We're really trying to key in on when did declines begin and how much can we pump without declines happening. For the lower priority sub areas, which are generally the bigger sub areas on the exterior borders of the critical groundwater area, we're focusing on implementing the 2018 pumpage limit. So as part of the groundwater study, we estimated groundwater use across the basin, and we've taken that report and determined what use was in the year 2018 with the intent of establishing that as the limit for pumping. So from a curtailment perspective, that will reduce authorized use, but from a business standpoint, it brings people back to 2018, which is a couple of years after the basin was classified, well after it was widely publicized by the department that there's serious problems with groundwater level declines, and the intent being to limit the impact to business while also holding to a firm line in the sand for groundwater level declines. And then with that, we want to pair enforcement of permit decline conditions. So where we have the ability to regulate off pumping because groundwater level declines have occurred within points of appropriation to a point where they have tripped that condition on their permit. We want to regulate those off. And then we also want this, 2018 pumpage limit to encourage voluntary reductions. So wherever possible, we want people to be working to reduce use and be as efficient as possible. So those are the two approaches we're taking. The high priority sub areas, we're going to determine what amount of pumpage can occur without declines and curtail to that point. And in the lower, we're going to focus there on the 2018 pumpage limit. So, Justin, did I hear the recording stopped?
Yes, you did.
Pause for a second while we get that going again.
That sounds good, thank you. Grant, are you still on?
Lost him.
Lost him. Okay, 1 second here. I'm gonna check the participants. I think, Kelly, are you with us? You're probably the person that has the next best set of experience with starting a recording.
I could do it. Oh, I need the host though. Can you make me a co-host?
Hopefully.
They're your co-host. Thanks,
Very
Kelly.
good. Thank you, Kelly.
And we're back. All right, so those are the two different approaches we're taking. So let's now talk about this hydrograph approach, and I'm going to try to make this as clear as possible. So when using the hydrograph approach, we're really trying to determine when declines began within a subarea. So we're going to either do that directly from hydrograph, where we have a long enough period of record that shows a clear inflection point, or we're going to try to project back decline rates to historically stable elevations. We're then going to determine the prior pumpage, so identify what was the maximum annual pumping that occurred prior to declines beginning, and then we're going to set that to the pumpage or to the PTW for that subarea. So it's a little bit easier to understand when you start looking at an actual hydrograph. So here we have a hydrograph from the Weaver Springs subarea. You can see we have a pretty long period of record going back to the 60s. And we have these basically stable groundwater level trends. And so using this approach, what we're saying is where groundwater levels are stable, we have pumpage values, and we're going to use the pumpage value from this period of time in which groundwater levels were stable. And we're going to use the maximum pumpage value for a year in which this time frame is stable, and set that as the PTW. And clearly there's an inflection point here in about 1993 where we go from stable groundwater levels and begin to have declining groundwater levels. And so our intent here is to take 1993 as the inflection point, and we're going to determine what the maximum amount of pumping was that occurred in a single year prior to 1993, and we're going to use that as the PTW value for pumping in this Weaver Springs subarea. So Weaver Springs is pretty clear-cut and straightforward. You can see, like, in the hydrograph exactly what's going on and what we're talking about here. Where it gets a little bit more challenging is in the other 5 subareas. We don't have that same historic water level record. And so we aren't able to look at a hydrograph and understand when that inflection point occurred. So in order to attempt to estimate that inflection point, we are taking a historically stable elevation, which we've derived from groundwater level contours from a USGS report by Leonard in 1970. And that's identifying that point where groundwater levels were stable. And so we're setting that as our historically stable elevation. We're then taking the water level record for a number of wells throughout the sub-area and calculating a decline trend, and estimating that decline trend and then backcasting that to the historically stable elevation. And so the point at which this decline trend line intercepts this historically stable elevation line becomes our inflection point. And you can see in this example that inflection point happens between 2007 and 2011. So somewhere in like the 2009-ish range. In this example, this is purely hypothetical. And so in this example, we're estimating that groundwater level declines began in 2009. And so for PTW, we would set whatever the highest value of pumpage was for a year prior to 2009. And that would be our PTW for that sub-area. So we've then gone on and done these calculations for many wells and gotten to a subset of data. We parsed that down and we've decided to go with primarily with the median value that we've come across with a whole host of wells in order to set that PTW. And so it's not just one well within a sub-area that we're using, but it's many. And more of that data, or all of that data, is available on our rulemaking website, and you can take a look at it if you want to dive into it. I didn't list it here because the original presentation took 30+ minutes, and we don't have that kind of time today. So if you want to learn more, the rulemaking website has all of these presentations, the supporting data, as well as video recordings of the actual RAC meetings if you want to listen to the conversation. So just to recap really quick, to determine the PTW, essentially what we're doing is we're asking ourselves, what is the inflection point in the hydrograph when declines began, right? So when did decline begin? Then what's the maximum amount of water that could be pumped without declines occurring? And then we're saying essentially that value, the maximum amount that was pumped without declines occurring, is going to be the PTW moving forward. So when we apply all of that information, we get to this proposed PTW calculation table. And this has been presented to the RAC. And what you'll see here is I have multiple columns with the intent of trying to get to the difference between actual use and authorized use, while also understanding what the curtailment or the PTW, how that impacts actual use of water. So here in this column, 2023 authorized sub-area total, we've got the authorized use. So this is what's on the paper water right. And you'll notice that the total for the critical groundwater area boundary is about 290,000 acre feet. And then we've got our 2018 estimated use. So this is the last year we estimated use for in the groundwater study. And you'll see the estimated use in that year was about 137,000 acre feet. So we're using about 47.3% of the authorized paper water is actually being pumped as beneficial use. So then we compare that to our proposed PTW numbers, and it's broken down by sub-area, but also totalized. So you can see we're proposing roughly 108, almost 109,000 acre feet of pumpage be allowed, which comes out to about a 21% curtailment when looking at it basin-wide. When looking at it by sub-area, though, obviously because we're targeting the high-priority sub-areas with the most severe declines, both from a magnitude and rate perspective, you see numbers, the highest being Weaver Springs with the proposed curtailment of nearly 75%, and the smallest being Dog Mountain at 28% curtailment. So that puts it in perspective what those numbers look like. And that's when comparing the PTW to the 2018 estimated use. If you were to compare these numbers to the authorized use, they would be much larger because, as I said before, authorized use is substantially larger than actual use. So that shows you all the proposed PTW. And then Additional conversations with the RAC. We're going to continue conversations we've been having. Everything I presented today, we'll continue to discuss, answer questions related to. And then a few additional topics, and this isn't the exhaustive list by any means, but we're going to talk about timing of curtailment. So how quickly do we try to enforce these PTW numbers? How rapidly do we try to stop the rates of decline? We want to talk about voluntary agreements, helping the community figure out what's possible from a voluntary standpoint. We want to talk about serious water management problem area, so requiring metering and water use reporting so that we have better data. We're going to talk about fiscal impact, and then the other topic that I didn't list here, it's a critical topic, is how we allocate the permissible total withdrawal. So do we allocate based on the paper water right, and do we provide the most senior user their full paper water right, or do we limit them somehow to their actual historic beneficial use? So if they've only been using half of their water that's on their paper water right, should they receive their full paper water right, or should they receive just what they've been beneficially using? And so those are future conversations that we're going to continue to have. So with that, I'd ask for any questions or comments from the members of GWAC here.
I have a couple. I'm going to try to be sensitive to the schedule. But a couple of things. Have any voluntary agreements, ideas, projects come to light so far? Are people pursuing anything that you know about?
We have been told that many people are considering them, and there are discussions happening at the community level, but we have not seen a proposal of any kind at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I really wasn't going to ask about specifics because just whether they were in the works or not. So
yeah.
At one point we were talking about groundwater elevations, and you said if you fall below a certain point, you get a gradient reversal. By that, did you mean like a reversal of flow out of the lake?
Potentially. But okay. More than anything, it's going to be a reversal of flow within around that cone of depression and a slowing of the flow towards the lake. Right. So likely the lake isn't going to empty out to refill these holes, but the amount of flow moving towards the lake will be lessened by those cones of depression.
Gotcha. I'll limit it to one more and then be quiet. So these high priority areas that you define, what would you say the strongest correlation is on? So I understand their group wide behavior wells, the rate of decline, et cetera. But what would you say the highest correlation is for those high priority groupings? Is it the density and magnitude of withdrawal in a specific area, or are there geologic controls that limit hydraulic continuity that play a bigger role? What would you say?
I would say it's a combination of both. So in these areas, we have a high density of development. And in these high priority sub-areas, we generally see wells that are capable of producing large quantities of large volumes of water. And that makes sense, right? If you're going to irrigate and you want to effectively get water, you want to put in high production wells. And so just through the process of development, it appears that these areas where there are high production wells have been more developed than areas with low production wells. So we have high production wells that are grouped together. But then in many of these areas, they are constrained geologically in that they're surrounded by basin fill sediments that are low permeability. Water does obviously move through those as quickly. And so we do not see those cones of depression able to be filled back in on a yearly basis. And so we have multi-decadal declines as these cones continue to deepen as they're not able to, fill back in. And that's purely a function of the geology out there. So it's a combination, if that.
Ah, thanks for the explanation, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to come off mute real quick and say that, Tim, you and your team have done a really great job on this rulemaking process. Really appreciate the department's leadership that you've shown with prioritizing the critical groundwater sub areas, with the setting the goal of stability, no further declines. All that's good stuff. One thing I'm always interested in is, validating and learning and adapting as needed. This is not news to you, Tim, but that the USGS Steve Gingrich's mod flow model is going to be released in the next 2 to 4 weeks as of 2 weeks ago, so 0 to 2 weeks, I guess. I'm just curious, have you or the department been able to test the proposed PTWs within that mod flow model, and see if those are going to successfully achieve the long-term goal of no further decline?
As the model isn't published yet, no, we have not. So we won't touch the model until it's published.
Got it. Well, is there a way to build that into the process to make sure that that does happen, and that we can test these scenarios and make sure that they're able to achieve the goals that we want them to achieve?
I definitely think that's worth discussing with the RAC, and we've been talking about it internally. I don't have an answer for you, but we're definitely discussing it.
Okay, sounds good. And I'm sure this is also on your radar, but Bill Jager from OSU is working with Steve Gingrich on that paired mod flow and economic model. You stated earlier that one of the goals was to limit impacts to businesses, which I totally understand and support. That particular work, I think, is going to be published in Water Resources Research. And similar question, are you talking about and thinking about how to leverage that information? Okay.
Absolutely. I think that'll be a huge part of our fiscal impact statement, right? So helping understand, it will help us understand what the impacts from a financial standpoint are of continued groundwater level declines, and what the, to compare what is the financial impact of additional decline with what's the impact if we are able to curtail quickly and halt groundwater level declines sooner, right? So where is that balance point? What does that look like? And hopefully what are the dollar values associated with that? That's the goal there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Zach.
Richard, go ahead.
I was wondering, during the racks, if the irrigators have indicated that they've been moving toward the more efficient use of the water. Like putting misters down right on top of the alfalfa instead of the large overhead guns and circles where they lose a lot to evaporation. Has there been quite a bit of improvement there?
I don't have any numbers related to how much of that has happened. We've definitely heard from many irrigators that they have been moving towards the MESA and LISA systems. So MESA being mid-elevation sprinklers and LISA being low-elevation sprinklers, right? With the intent of getting the water down underneath the canopy of the crop to reduce that evaporative loss, as you said, and to be more targeted. So we've definitely heard much about that, but I don't have any numbers for how much of that has actually happened. So I
wasn't looking for specific numbers, just if there was an indication that a number of the irrigators were moving in that direction.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we've heard has been, though, that when we're talking about curtailment, they don't want to spend money on infrastructure if they don't know they're going to have water on that field. So why change out my pivot? Why improve if I may not have water in a couple of years due to regulation? So we're doing our best to be transparent and try to help people understand where we're headed, and what that's going to look like, so that they can make those investments where it makes the most sense and reduce use and help the process overall. Absolutely.
One more question is, do you have good historic pumpage information?
Yeah, so the groundwater study produced a couple of methods of estimating pumpage. The one that we're relying on mostly because of how the numbers have come out has been the Beamer and Hoskinson report, which focused on using evapotranspiration data and pairing that with flow meter data to calibrate and to estimate groundwater pumpage based on satellite-based ET. And so for the most part, we've relied on that. There's another report that was done that looked at authorized use and historic use that way. But we're really leaning on more on the evapotranspiration groundwater pumping estimated use Beamer and Hoskinson report.
So the users historically in that basin haven't been metered?
As with all things in Oregon, meter related, newer permits have meter requirements, older permits do not. So it really depends on the permit. There are challenges with meters in the Harney Basin. Traditional impeller-driven meters often get chewed up quickly. They move a lot of sand through the systems there, which cause challenges with impeller-based meters. So it's not simple and straightforward, unfortunately, as these things rarely are. But where we have good quality data, we've done our best to pair that up with satellite-based ET data and get to estimated use that way.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Any other questions for Tim on the Harney Basin?
Well, I guess I just want to make sure that any other questions from the committee folks, and if not, Phil, perhaps it'd be good to take a moment for any public comment on this agenda item before we move on.
Oh yeah, I see Greg has his hand up there.
All right, yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Greg Capillas here. I'm a hydrogeologist and a water rights examiner with Pacific Hydrogeology. And let's see, yeah, I guess the question I had here was for Tim. And I'm just kind of wondering, when you're looking at these areas with the, really significant declines, and you're also looking at the hydrographs and these inflection points. Are you, kind of looking at the history of well construction in those areas to see if or consider if there's influences from commingling wells, for example, if part of the declines could possibly be explained by commingling wells?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Greg. So what the groundwater study showed us was that the groundwater reservoir within the Harney Basin is all one hydraulically connected system. So there are no known barriers to flow, and so that's both horizontally and vertically. A commingled well, while we now have a deeper system and a shallower system, that's more a function of the amount of pumping that has happened at deeper levels, creating a change in head there between the shallower wells and the deeper wells. Commingling isn't as much an issue as it would be in, say, a confined system. So it's all one big system there.
Okay, great. And then I just had one comment, I guess, in response to one of the questions about efficiencies of irrigation systems and so forth out there. And I mean, just a little anecdote, I guess. I attended a it was a tour, I guess, for the commission meeting out in Harney Basin. I don't know, when was it, October or something, or God, it was a while back. But anyways, very interesting. We did a little tour on Representative Owen's farm, and he had one circle there that he had converted over to these I forget what you call it. You had a term for it. The very low sprinklers. They're just like few inches above the ground, and he apparently had been able to reduce his water use on that circle to about 1 acre foot per acre, which I think is pretty significant. And the costs for him to retrofit his circle were not, really not that high. It didn't seem like. So seems like there are a lot of opportunities out there for that. That's really all I had.
Great. Well, we're about 20 minutes behind schedule, but I think that was time well spent. That'd be a hard topic for Tim to cover in 15. There's a lot going on there, and it's important. So I think that was time well spent. If there's nothing else, though, we should move on to agenda item G, which is the groundwater allocation rulemaking update from Justin.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So yeah, once again, my apologies on the switch up. If I was giving the overview, it probably would have been 15 minutes, but I appreciate Tim coming in and giving a more thorough treatment of where we're at. Before I dive into the allocation, I just want to frame up where we are on our various rulemakings, especially for our new folks. Also, I want to acknowledge that Chuck Bobert has joined us early on in the last agenda item, so want to welcome Chuck as a new committee member. Thank you very much. And so recap for the folks that were with us for the past year or more, and summary or introduction for the new folks to the committee. We are currently in process with 2 pretty significant rulemaking items. So the Harney Basin critical groundwater area and potentially significant water management problem area designations through the Division 512 Basin Program rules is the one that we just heard about. That's been ongoing for some time and is, a takeoff from all the previous work that we did there. I'm sorry, Tim, if I missed it, but can you tell us roughly, and I don't know that we've got a projected end date, but how at a minimum, how many more RAC meetings are we planning to have, and where's that going to take us?
So currently scheduled are 2 more RAC meetings, and that'll take us through the end of May. We absolute soonest we foresee any sort of adoption of these rules would be end of this year. But that is tentative, and we have a lot more work to do before we can get there. So,
yeah, and so what we've been trying to do with the Groundwater Advisory Committee is make sure that we keep the committee updated as we go, and make sure that folks are aware of how things are progressing, because as we get toward adoption, one of the statutory roles of the committee is to provide input to the commission on any proposed rule changes that affect groundwater. So we want to make sure that we're keeping folks as up to speed and informed as we can approaching that period of time. We also want to get the committee's advice to the commission during the open public comment period. And so that's another timing consideration. So again, recap for folks and introduction for new folks. With recent rule changes, talking with the committee either our committee meeting has landed within the public comment period and we've been able to do that. Other times, our regularly scheduled quarterly committee meetings don't align with the public comment period, and we've had a special meeting within that public comment period to take the work through the committee's advice to the commission. And so that is what we'll plan to do with 512, depending on how the timing shakes out. One last thing I'll say is over the past couple of years, we've endeavored to have a groundwater advisory committee member on the rules advisory committee so that there's somebody on GWAC that has kind of firsthand knowledge of the rules advisory committee process, and so they can help the whole committee along too and be a peer resource, if you will. So for 512, Ken Bentz, who's unfortunately wasn't able to join us today, is a groundwater advisory committee member that's on the RAC as well. And also Zach Reed, maybe that's untrue. Are you on the 512 RAC as well, Zach?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, Zach's doing a lot of work here. So Zach is a new member to GWAC that has also been on the 512 RAC, as well as transitioning to the allocation RAC along with Phil Brown. So those are the folks that have some firsthand knowledge of how the RAC is working as well. So with that background on 512, I'm going to transition now to the groundwater allocation rulemaking. With respect to that, the process started with a commission discussion in late 2021. We began briefing this groundwater advisory committee way back in March 2022, and I believe that we've had an agenda item for the allocation rulemaking every RAC since then, and today is no different. With that process, the Rules Advisory Committee process for groundwater allocation began in April of 2023. We held 8 meetings plus a couple bonus technical sessions that ran through January or February of this year. And we began a 90-day public comment period on those rules March 1st. And that runs through May 31st. And so the next groundwater advisory committee meeting, next GWAC meeting is scheduled for June. So that's going to be just a few weeks past the end date of the public comment period. And therefore, I'll want to talk with GWAC about whether or not they feel that today would be a good day to work out advice for the commission, or whether you'd like to schedule a separate standalone meeting to do that sometime before May 30th. So keep that in mind. Like I said, the public comment period is started and is ongoing. The department's going to be holding public hearings throughout the state in April and May. So we're going to start in Bend on April 4th, and then pretty much every 2 weeks, we're going to continue on. Maybe I can pull up the actual dates here instead of generalizing. So we'll be in LeGrand, April 18th. We'll be in Central Point, Medford area, May 16th. And then we'll have our final public hearing in Salem that will include an online option to join on May 21st. And so thank you, Laura, for putting in the website for the rulemaking so folks can find that and find the specifics of those public hearings. The way that we will organize these events is we're going to have an information session ahead of the public hearing. So we'll give a presentation. I'm planning to present that to this group here shortly so that you all can hear what we're going to present as informational. And then we'll have a break and then reconvene a public hearing later in the evening. So that's how each of those 4 events are going to work. And of course, written public comment can be delivered anytime through Laura Hart, our rules coordinator, and there's a specific, I believe, email address in the website that she just posted. So I want to acknowledge that my informational session presentation is similar to what I presented to GWAC last meeting in November. And we've got a few new people, but for everybody else, it's going to be largely review. I'm happy to go through that as I would anyway, just to get everybody on the same page. But I want to make sure that folks are nodding along, that that's a good use of our time. I got Richard's thumbs up. And Kelly, go ahead, what do you have?
Yeah, I have to go to other meetings, so do we want to pause here and make sure the recording catches your presentation?
Yes, that sounds great. Why don't you drop off and we'll monitor the recording and I'll get in touch with our IT folks if it doesn't work. Thank you, Kelly, and thanks for stepping in and doing that. Okay, so unless there's any objections, I will queue that up. Looks like our recording is continuing. I will queue that up and provide that public information session, and then we've got the rest of the time up until noon to discuss with the committee. And again, at that point, I'll ask folks if they feel like it's a good time to draft any advice or whether you'd rather reconvene, and we'll set a date to do that. All right, great. I'm gonna check the chat here real quick. That looks like, oh, and Laura's email address, great. Okay, so bear with me for a moment while I get this presentation queued up. And then let's see. All right, how am I gonna do this? Okay, so now I believe that I'm sharing with everybody just a cover slide and not my speaker notes. Is that true? Can I get a thumbs up?
You're good.
All right, thank you, Laura. Okay, again, the plan is to run through this pre-hearing information session set of slides that I've got queued up in order to hopefully get everybody on the same page as to what we're talking about, a quick groundwater primer, issues that have arisen from appropriation over the past 70-ish years, an overview of the proposed changes to the rules governing how we allocate groundwater, and then some details on the 2 major proposed changes in rulemaking, and that is a focus on assessing whether or not reasonably stable water levels exist before we determine water is available for a new use, and how we assess the potential for substantial interference with tributary surface water. And then I'll wrap up with the implications and next steps, if you will. So first of all, first section here, going to give a brief background again on some key groundwater concepts, talk about groundwater development to date. So I always, well, not always, but recently, this has been the starting slide of every presentation I've given because I want to make sure to emphasize that groundwater is just one pathway in the water cycle. So it receives recharge through deep infiltration from precipitation, snowmelt, other ways that water seeps into the ground. And that happens relatively continuously over the long run. And because there's a constant input, that water is flowing through the ground and is generally discharging someplace. And in Oregon, that is often discharged to springs and stream base flow. When we talk in this discussion about hydraulically connected surface waters, it's that nexus there between groundwater discharging to surface water that we're talking about with that term hydraulic connection. And for the purposes of this talk and this rulemaking, when we talk about allocation, we're talking about folks applying for a water right to tap into that groundwater flow path and draw water out for a beneficial use. And so if and when we issue water rights for groundwater use in a hydraulically connected system, we are pumping water out of that flow path that was previously going someplace else. So to put this in another way, here's a picture of a spring complex along the Metolius River. And similarly, I hope that it could be relatively intuitive that when we drill a well into this groundwater system, if we pump water out, we are going to reduce that spring flow by a similar amount or the same roughly amount. And two more things to consider. If we put in many wells, we will have cumulative impacts, right? We'll build up those impacts on that spring system. And while we can move those wells further away from the stream, and that will allow us to kind of disperse the impacts over a larger area and increase the amount of time, what's termed the time to full capture, the amount of time it takes for the full pumping rate to show up at these springs over long enough periods of time. That's where the water comes from, is from reduced discharge to the streams. And that's a key thing to keep in mind as we move forward. So with this concept of multiple wells, cumulative impacts, we have certainly developed a number of wells. This set of plots shows the increase in water wells installed in the state between 1955, when the Groundwater Act was passed, and 2016 is when I pulled these figures and have kept that because that's also the time that we've got the best estimates of use statewide. And really what I want to point out here, this is a density map where warmer colors of dots show greater number or density of wells per square mile, with cooler dots being lower density. And I'll just point out that development has not been evenly distributed across the state. It's concentrated in some areas. And also that similar differential distribution occurs with precipitation, with recharge, with geologic subsurface structure, et cetera. So it's not even everywhere. There's areas of more intense and less intense development, recharge, et cetera. So with respect to those roughly 250,000 wells, I also just want to point out the types of wells that accounts for and the total percent of use that accounts for. So blue bars here are the percent of water wells by type that are listed on the bottom. So almost 90% of that 250,000 wells are used for domestic purposes. whereas about 7% are used for irrigation and so on down the line, community wells being municipal, quasi-municipal water system wells. However, the percent of total use, as estimated by the USGS for 2015, which is the most recent estimates we have, are shown on the red bars, where, that majority of wells accounts for about 4% of total use for domestic households. Irrigation wells are generally higher capacity and account for about 80+% of use. Those community or municipal wells are in a similar situation, generally higher capacity, result in a pretty significant amount of use. So I've got this note here that about 10% of all wells are permitted and account for 95% of pumping. So those are the irrigation wells, the community wells. Some of these other categories, domestic and livestock, are what we call permit exempt. So those are wells that are able to be drilled and used for those relatively small purposes without going through the permitting process. So as we talk about this groundwater allocation rulemaking, we're talking about the process by which we issue new rights to these generally larger use cases going forward. And all these existing wells are not affected by the rulemaking, nor are the exempt use wells. And exempt use wells, because they're exempt from permitting, will continue on as they are today with these statutory exemptions. So with that, we've allocated quite a bit as shown, and we're starting to see some signs of over allocation. So this map is indicating wells where we have water level records that show that the spring high water level is more than 50 feet below the highest known spring high water level, and that's a defined threshold for what's termed an excessively declined water level in rural. Again, those records are clustered in some parts of the state, but there are instances of excessively declined water levels across much of the state. It's a statewide issue. To take a look at kind of what that means for water levels over time, I've just chosen one example as an anecdote. This is a domestic well that is monitored south of the Dells, an area that saw or has seen some pretty significant development for cherry and other orchard crops. And this shows water levels dropping, over the years from the mid-60s to today, in excess of about 125 feet over the past 60 years. This particular well is about 300 feet deep, so it's still able to produce domestic water for its intended purpose. However, not all wells are in that same boat. So shallower wells have led to some a good deal of dry well complaints. On the surface water side, we're also seeing signs about over allocation. This is a map that's anecdotal, and I just want to make sure that I'm not being misleading with this. This map is showing the earliest priority date in each administrative basin that the water master regulates back to. So for much of the state in the eastern and southern parts, the water masters on at least one stream in each of those basins are regulating back and shutting off users that received a water right in the late 1800s. So there's, at least one stream there, and there's probably multiple streams that are close behind. But the key point I want to make here is that when the water masters shut down surface water users to make sure that senior users get their their rightful amount of appropriation, groundwater users, even those groundwater users that are hydraulically connected, are in the vast majority of cases allowed to continue pumping, and they, in a hydraulically connected system, will also have impacts on those streams. Similarly, when we look at surface water availability, this is a map showing availability of new surface water rights by water availability basin in August. And everything in tan colors there has no further surface water available for allocation, meaning that by the water availability reporting system calculations, we've allocated more surface water than exists in those streams more than 80% of the time. And again, in hydraulically connected systems, groundwater contributes flow to those streams. And we'll touch on that in more detail in a little bit. So overallocation has some pretty significant side effects. It can lead to drying up of wells, or at the least increased pumping costs for everybody in the area. It can lead to reduced stream flow, lead to deterioration of water quality, both groundwater quality and surface water quality, and can lead to curtailment of rights that people have invested in. All these are something that we certainly want to avoid. We heard earlier about the water well repair, replacement, and abandonment fund. That's a significant cost that comes from drying wells. We talked about the 512 rulemaking to establish a critical groundwater area, and the likelihood of curtailing rights that people have invested in. That's really disruptive and economically painful, so also to be avoided. And that's really the key driver of our rulemaking that's been ongoing. So for this groundwater allocation rulemaking, if over allocation is undesirable, let's look at allocation, how we got there and how we might change things. And as we entered into this, we set out an objective early on that guided how we went about this process. I've shown this to the RAC many, many times to try and keep us focused. But again, our goal was to take a look at updating groundwater allocation rules such that they would be more sustainable and protective of existing water right holders, both in stream and out of stream. So we started with our statutory authority. The statute reference here, 537-621, describes what's colloquially termed a 4-part test for determining whether or not the department should issue a new water right. And of that 4-part test, which is bulleted there, we've really focused on just one, which is water is available. So we decided to look at the availability of water for further use. And when we look at the current rules, they say that a requested groundwater source is available if it's not overallocated. And that overallocated is further defined. And in bullets here are the kind of 2 major things that we look at. So first of all, as it's constructed now, the rules have us allocate up to the full annual recharge volume of the aquifer. And so I put back up a portion of that water cycle here. And if you recall, this is kind of a depiction of our annual recharge volume. And again, that recharge is going somewhere and discharging somewhere, but the current rules say you can take that all, right? And if we pump that all, of course, we will be really diminishing kind of what comes out downstream. We have another set of rules that address groundwater surface water interaction. And those rules essentially guide us to avoid short-term and acute impacts to surface water, but they allow for cumulative impacts and long-term impacts to accrue. And so we want to take a look at addressing that as well. And just in general overview of how we went about that, our proposed rules have these significant changes, and these highlighted items we'll come back to in further detail in a little bit later in the presentation. But essentially, we wanted to take this concept of allocating up to the full annual recharge and say, hey, we're not going to allocate until we're over allocated and then stop allocating at the same time we try and fix the problem. We want to take a look at whether or not water levels are reasonably stable and tie that to whether the requested source is available for further allocation. So reasonably stable water levels is a term that is part of legislative policy that's been in statute that hasn't been defined in rule since it appeared in the statutes in 1955, and therefore it hasn't been terribly functional for us. And so defining what that means has been a major push of this effort. And then with respect to hydraulically connected surface water, as opposed to a set of rules that lays out some what I'll call thresholds for this is too much or too close to issue, and this is something further away is going to develop impacts over sufficient time, more than a year, or sufficient quantity, 1% of the natural stream flow or in-stream water rights. We're saying, hey, if you have a hydraulically connected groundwater source that's providing discharge to surface water, we want to look at that tributary surface water body and ask, is water available there, or is that surface water fully allocated? So we'll go into both those things in a bit more detail a little bit later on. Do just want to summarize the public involvement we've had over time with commission agenda items, GWAC engagement. I guess I'll need to update this slide to 8 meetings before I give it next. Public outreach, RAC meetings. We've done a good deal of additional outreach to groups, League of Oregon Cities, maybe that was counties. Anyway, we've talked to city groups, county groups, ag groups, tribal groups, a lot of other instances where we've given this type of presentation as requested. And a good deal of that information is all available on our rulemaking website, which Laura linked to earlier in the chat, and recordings as well if you'd like to see previous iterations of this talk. Also, just want to make sure that we acknowledge that our RAC roster was at least 30 members strong, had broad representation from tribes, local governments, farmers, ranchers, exempt well users, drillers, conservation groups, folks from economics and climatology departments at OSU, lawyers, consultants, and other concerned folks. So pretty broad roster to gather input from on these rules. So with that, I'm going to jump into the key issues. Again, those 2 highlighted items. Defining reasonably stable groundwater levels is first. Talking about hydraulically connected wells is key issue number 2. And just talk about how we got there and what the rule language looks like. So again, reasonably stable groundwater levels is a legislative policy term in statute. In looking at how to define that, we first want to define some science-based framework to guide us. We found this this paper that we thought did a pretty good job in defining something really similar, which is called the dynamically stable range. And so we're focusing on this blue line, which describes groundwater levels over time. Each kind of instance here of rising and falling is representative of annual cycles in groundwater levels. Summer pumping season where water levels drop, followed by a winter recharge season where water levels rise again in response to rainfall infiltration and the fact that we're not irrigating crops, and that continues on. This also shows the kind of spring peaks as being somewhat cyclical, rising and falling over time, and that matches or acknowledges the climate variability we see in Oregon, where our precipitation tends to have a 10-year cycle of wet and dry periods with a shorter El Nino, La Nina cycle in there as well. So we get some natural variability in precipitation amounts, and that leads to some natural variability in our spring highs. But in general, there's wet cycles, dry cycles, annual pumping cycles, and that stays in what these folks have termed a dynamically stable range. And so we took that as our model, and then the next step was for us to say, okay, that's the general model. We want to actually put some values to that for Oregon so that we can have some thresholds and rule for what we want to look at. And the punchline is that we took a look at all of our existing wells and water level data. We, I think, looked at more than 9,000 wells. We isolated what we could assess as wells with long periods of record, 25 years or more, and that responded dominantly to climate cycles, and narrowed that down to about 360-ish wells with those long-term trends. And we looked at, what is kind of the maximum rate of decline we saw in these downswings, and what was the overall total range of highs and lows for that set of wells, and looked at that for all those wells, looked at a cumulative frequency plot, and found that these values, this decline rate of roughly half a foot a year or less over a 5 to 20-year average period. So again, trying to incorporate response to those decadal climate cycles, and a total swing of 25 feet or less that captured more than 90% of wells in the state with those long-term climate driving records. And so we took that information and put that into our rule language, which I've tried to summarize succinctly here. And so our proposed new rule for reasonably stable groundwater levels is, again, water level declines occur no more than roughly half a year over that 5 to 20-year period, or 25 feet total. We're measuring that from the highest known water level in that aquifer part thereof, so representative aquifer data. And we've defined kind of a minimum amount of information that we need to perform that test. So again, data from that aquifer, it can be a neighboring well from a particular application. We want at least 5 years of data as a minimum to make that calculation with. We want our final data point to be within the last 5 years. And with that, we'll apply these criteria to see, is this reasonably stable or not? Over time and discussion with the RAC, we added in some additional considerations. So this highest known water level might be set at we didn't put this in rule, but a quote unquote natural level. So we wanted to acknowledge some instances where we saw water levels jump up when a dam was installed, and that kind of backed up water not only in the reservoir, but also in the surrounding groundwater system. Also, we've got some instances around aquifer storage and recovery wells where storing water in the ground through injection has raised water levels above what appear to be their historic background levels. So we wanted to account for that where we needed to. In areas where we don't have data, but also have seen no prior development, we wanted to allow an assumption that groundwater levels would be in that dynamically stable range with climate in those instances. And lastly, we wanted to acknowledge that basin program rules could redefine what's considered a reasonably stable water level for that basin or a portion thereof, and indicated that in those basin program rule discussions, if those were to occur, we'd want to ensure that any proposed alternate reasonably stable water level definition would capture or assess impacts to potentially drying wells, impacts to ecosystems dependent on groundwater, and how that would impact the long-term sustainability of those local systems. So with that, we'll put up a hindsight example of how this might work or might have worked. So this is an example of water level declines in the Harney Basin in Weaver Springs, which Tim talked about earlier, and essentially showing a composite hydrograph here of reasonably stable water levels having some kind of slight swing, and then on the downswing it just kept on going down with development. So applying the proposed rules, we would find reasonably stable up to this 25-foot decline mark, or it may very well have been rate triggered as well, depending, I can't do this quite quick enough, what the total rate of decline was over the past 5 to 20 years. However, under our current rules, we did continue issuing approximately another 2,500 acres of irrigated land between 2007 and 2012, when we crossed this threshold of 50 feet that defines declined excessively. So if these rules were in place, we may have still over allocated a bit, but it would be a lot less than we find ourselves in the position of. And now, again, as Tim went over, we're in the really bad situation of being forced to curtail back pumping and drying up land that folks have invested in irrigating. So in addition to there are a lot of surrounding wells that see impacts from water levels that are not reasonably stable. Again, we touched on the wharf fund, the well abandonment repair and replacement fund that addresses dry domestic wells. As part of that program, or leading up to that program, we set up an online reporting system, a voluntary reporting system for dry well complaints. That system has clocked more than 1,200 dry well complaints since July of 2021 when we started it. And to access those well abandonment repair replacement funds, one has to file a dry well complaint. Tracking the cost to deepen a well that's gone dry, just based on that wharf fund, average cost is about $26,500 per well. And we talked about kind of re-upping that program to another $1 million. Just want to acknowledge that we have spent $8 million to date, and that includes some county funds, including Klamath County, set up a separate fund, and some federal funds that people have been able to tap into. And certainly additional demand exists. Over the course of this process, we took a look at just the risk of all water wells to groundwater level declines, and just looking at well log reports and static water level upon completion compared to total depth. There's approximately 15,000 wells where the total depth is 25 feet or less below the static water level, and so those wells would all be at risk of a 25-foot drop. So want to make sure that I'm communicating this is the risk. We don't expect water level to drop 25 feet statewide, but just statewide, this is the number of wells that could be at risk. And if we look at the next kind of defined value of 50 feet for excessively declined, that puts about 55,000 wells at risk. 55,000 wells have total depths less than 50 feet below static water level at the time they were drilled. So it gives some indication of the potential magnitude of the problem. And if you start to multiply out that average cost to deepen by the wells at risk, that can be a pretty significant liability. So trying not to get there with this rulemaking process. With that, I'm going to move on to this issue number 2, which is redefining the potential for substantial interference with surface water. So again, just want to bring us back, since it's been a few slides, the very first one we started out with, and just, kind of summarizing this. In hydraulically connected systems where groundwater is discharging to surface water, we're going to balance pumping of groundwater with a loss of water somewhere, and often that's the base flow discharge. And so again, I've used this anecdote many times, but I'll say it one more time. This is Eagle Creek. This is a picture taken in late August, place where I've been many Augusts, and there's always water flowing here, even though it has been unlikely to have rained significantly in the past 2 or 3 months. There's no storage above this photo. This is in a wilderness area, and there's no snowpack. This is relatively low elevation. So this flow is dominantly almost fully groundwater discharge. And so that's precipitation that's fallen throughout the earlier parts of the year, winter and spring, soaked into the ground, flowed through the groundwater system, and is discharging to keep that stream flowing, again, despite lack of precip for months, no storage, no snow. Now, further downstream from here, folks with water rights, surface water rights, depend on that water, and there's not enough water to meet junior users' needs. So users with 1970s priority date, the water master has indicated, get regulated off about 3 of every 4 years. And there's no, by the water availability reporting system, there's no more surface water available for allocation. That said, under the current rules and policy, new groundwater uses have been installed in this watershed, not right up next to the stream, but more than a mile away from the stream, that have priority dates in the early 2000s era. And we could, under the current rules, continue to issue groundwater rights that will impact this base flow that isn't suitable to meet the current commitments we've made through the water rights system. So the proposed rules essentially say, if a proposed groundwater use is in a groundwater system that flows to and discharges to the stream, a hydraulically connected system, then the potential for substantial interference isn't based on, you can have a well that takes 1% of this flow we see here, or as long as you're more than a mile away, we're going to assume that those impacts are going to build over, years or decades. And so that's fine. We aren't thinking that far ahead. we're instead proposing that we start looking at surface water availability and see, can this surface water source support more development that would continue to nick away at those flows. So that's the major change that we're proposing. This is a relatively new example for this presentation. Just wanted to point to something on the drier side of the state. This is the Sprague River down in the northern Klamath Basin. Just want to be clear, this river does receive snowmelt. There's more going on here than just groundwater. However, we have well pumping tests where we've monitored springs in this basin, significant spring flows in the 100+ GPM range, where when wells are turned on, those springs just stop flowing in less than 24 hours. And so we know through that in a cooperative study that groundwater does provide support to summertime flows in the Sprague. And similarly to the Eagle Creek example, the Sprague is regulated off for surface water users every year since 2014, while groundwater users that are hydraulically connected to this system continue to pump. And while I want to be clear that the current rulemaking isn't going to address that impact of groundwater users that have existing permits continuing to pump, it will allow us not to make the problem continually worse across the state in similar situations. So, real quick summary of the actual rule changes. So our proposed rules have us step through kind of two divisions. Division 9, which focuses on groundwater surface water interaction, asks us to go through these steps. First of all, determine whether or not the proposed use is hydraulically connected. The process for doing that will remain the same in the future under the proposed rules as it is today. We will look at the impacts that are expected over the proposed period of use. So for a limited license or a emergency drought use permit, that might be less than a year or a few years. For a proposal for a permanent permit, that is essentially forever. Permits don't expire, they go to certificate and they're passed down through generations. And once we look at those impacts, then again, our new proposed definition of potential for substantial interference has us look at the tributary surface water availability to include that as a component of water availability. So that those components are defined in Division 8 for substantial interference. So we look at, is the tributary surface water already over appropriated, withdrawn, or restrictively classified in rule? Is it the source of surface water rights that are regulated off by water masters, indicating there's not enough water there for current existing senior users? Or are there in-stream rights that are unmet during any period of the year on that stream? And essentially, if that surface water source has already been fully allocated, the proposed new rules say that we should not find waters available for additional new groundwater uses that are contributing to that, to the flow in those streams. And so that means that if these new rules are promulgated, the department wouldn't find groundwater is available nearly as often as it does now. And for hydraulically connected aquifers, groundwater availability will essentially be the same as surface water availability. And that's going to mean that we're going to need to look to other options to meet our future growing needs for water. There's a number of existing options, including conservation, storage, reuse, and the transfer process. And there's potential new or future opportunities that folks are talking about, including mitigation programs or market-based approaches, and also outcomes that might come from basin and regional planning groups. I want to end with what we see are the benefits of the proposed rules to existing users. So again, there are a good number of existing water rights out there, and by ensuring reasonably stable water levels, we believe that the new rules are going to limit the drying of shallower wells, which are dominantly domestic wells, will limit increasing pumping costs due to water level declines for folks that need to lift water from lower and lower depths under declining water levels, will address the potential deterioration of water quality or lessen that, and also limit the curtailment of rights that people have invested in. Again, this critical groundwater area process has been, it's long, it's expensive, it's really painful for everybody involved, especially those folks that have made investments on the ground. So it's really bad policy for us to be issuing rights that we later have to pull back. For surface water users that receive groundwater base flow, again, the proposed new rules are going to limit existing surface water users being curtailed, and also limit the number of in-stream water rights that aren't met going into the future. So generally, overall benefits, again, we believe that the proposed rules better honor the prior appropriation doctrine that our water rights system is based on, will reduce the extent and number of future conflicts that we might see over water allocation, and will support increased certainty for existing users that the water that they have senior rights to will continue to be there going forward. I've mentioned water quality a couple of times. I think that there's also good to keep in mind that limiting water level declines will also limit the need for folks to drill deeper, where water quality can be less desirable at depth because of just residents' time in the ground. We've seen examples of this in the Harney Basin, even in the Willamette Basin, where water can get saltier at depth or have more arsenic or boron at depth. And also, we're potentially, well, not potentially, the new rules are going to limit further reductions of groundwater discharge to surface water, where groundwater in the summer especially is usually a cool input and relatively clean compared to surface water quality in the late summer, and that'll support TMDL management going forward for surface water supplies. So with that, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're currently in the written public comment period from March 1st through May 31st. We're going to be holding these public hearings around the state in April and May. And then our current plan is to present the proposed rules to the commission for adoption in September. And that really gets to the discussion point for the commission is we would like, or excuse me, for this groundwater advisory committee, is that we want to ensure that we get any advice from the committee into the record before May 31st in order to be incorporated with all the other public comment that we receive and present to the commission in September. So this link's already been put in the chat, so I'm not going to linger here. And with that, I will stop sharing and ask the committee, I guess, first, if you have any questions, and then after that, how we want to handle potential advice to the commission.
Well, if you want another meeting, why not shoot for about the middle of May somewhere?
Yeah, and really, it's not necessarily whether I want a meeting, but whether the committee wants another meeting, so, you know, the actual rule language has been filed with the Secretary of State, so there's, I guess, the potential to look at that. The Rules Advisory Committee has looked at almost all the rule language multiple times, and we did make some final relatively minor tweaks after the last rack based on the comments we received with what we submitted to the Secretary of State, but anyway, this group, if you'd like to do that, you're welcome to do that. If you have any other questions or want to think about it, we can certainly set up another meeting to reconvene before the end of May.
So Justin, let me ask a question on the format and the process, which might inform a decision about, you know, whether it's today or a future meeting. So in the past, we've worked on when, you know, I think it was almost 2 years ago, the last time we did this. As a group, we formulated a statement to share with the commission. I think you were drafting real time. We edited real time. I think we might have routed it to the committee for one final look over, and that was the document you took. Is that the process you're proposing, that if we select to do that, that's what we would do today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dictate the process, but that you're right. That's what we've done in the past, and that seemed to work out fairly well for something that the committee could make a formal, you know, motion to vote on if we had it up on the screen and written so everybody could see it and everybody could contribute to it.
Okay.
That I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Well, then I guess I would pose a question to the committee members, and the reason I would do this is being, you know, present for the RAC. You know, it's a large and diverse group of people on the Rules Advisory Committee, and there's a significant, I would say it's almost uniform comments support changes to the current process. I don't think I've heard anybody say out loud, no change in the rules is needed. But that said, not everybody, it's a diverse group, and not everybody shares the opinion that they support these particular rule changes. One of the universal comments you hear also is that it's a big deal, and it's gonna be a big change, and it's gonna affect a lot of people. So knowing that there's, even on the advisory committee, there's not universal, you know, enthusiasm for the magnitude of the changed rules. I mean, maybe we ought to like just poll the group and say, are we, you know, of a like mind here, where we could easily craft something where we're sharing either support of the rule changes or not supporting rule changes, suggestions for difference, you know, parts of that. I mean, if we can't have a uniform mind of that, you know, maybe it does speak to another meeting where we draft a position or two, maybe a couple of opinions that we want to share with the commission, and give people a chance to think about it. So, I mean, if there's folks that are vehemently opposed to the rule changes, I mean, and folks that are much in support of the rule changes, that might dictate the best path forward. So, I mean, I can go on record. I mean, I support the position of why the department is addressing the rule changes. I think a tremendous amount of work has gone into this. A lot of the comments received from the RAC have been very detailed and very thoughtful. A lot of people have done a lot of work, and you know, the department has done a tremendous amount here, and I think they've ended up in a good place. Nothing's perfect, but I think they've ended up in a good place. And you know, the Basin presentation that was delivered earlier today was a good, I don't know, analog for why this is needed. You know, there's only half the water rights that have been issued have been used, and that's still too much. And until recently, water rights were still being issued. So, you know, that process needs to be resolved somehow. And I think this has been a fairly pragmatic way of getting at it. That's not to say that I'm not trying to minimize people's comments where they say, well, this is a big deal. This is going to impact people's lives. This is going to, in some cases, have an economic or a personal impact on how people choose to grow their business or their farms. I think that's all true, but I also think that you can't fix the system without any of those consequences. So, you know, I personally support the rule change moving forward, but would understand if people have concerns at the same time.
I'll jump in as a domestic water user and say that I support the rule changes. I've lived through in a critical groundwater area since the 1950s. And at that time saw what over allocation had created. And I basically wholeheartedly support the rule changes that have been proposed.
I'll chime in and say much the same thing. It's important for us to acknowledge the impacts, that this is an important big change for the state of Oregon. But it's a change that's sorely needed, and frankly was probably a change that was needed a decade or two ago in order to avert a lot of the impacts we're seeing in water scarcity and drought today. So, you know, I could go on about this for a while, but I think, you know, Justin, your presentation is a good one, demonstrates how fundamentally based in evidence these rules are and the approach that you're trying to take is. I know Phil, I won't soapbox here because the point, I think what you're asking, Phil, of us is just where we are as a committee. And I will just stop by saying I'm in a position of firm support.
Other folks got thoughts? Or preferences on a path forward? Would you like to be able to have a chance to put your thoughts in writing before sharing? I'm just trying to facilitate getting to a point where we can put something together and move it towards the commission.
I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I'm just wondering if it would be appropriate to have perhaps, I mean, I'd like to comment, provide, you know, maybe a slightly different perspective. I think it might be worthwhile for the members of the committee to hear a different perspective on this before maybe making a decision on how to move ahead.
I think the first thing in front of us, Greg, is the process for how to get there, rather than, you know, and I guess the reason for the poll was, in my mind, if there was unanimous support or unanimous objection, then it might be easy to craft something real time today. And if there's not, and we need to have some carefully thought out positions that reflected the dichotomy of opinion, then that might be something we would do in writing.
I guess all I'm trying to say is that if you know, I had an opportunity to make some comments here that might possibly sway a member one way or the other. Maybe there are some members of this committee that there's some things they don't know about. I don't know. Or that they don't fully understand. I guess I just think it's at this point, maybe it would be appropriate to allow some public comment that could potentially provide some additional input that might be useful in making that decision.
Well, we've got committee discussion is needed, followed by public comments. So I think we're in the committee discussion phase right now, Greg. Let's figure out if we're going to craft this, and then we can incorporate public comments. Let's figure out what we're going to do for the rest of the day, and then we can have public comments. That's my suggestion.
I guess I'm not sure what the point of the public comment then is, really. What's the point of the public comment period if the committee is going to make a decision on how to move forward without even considering that public comment?
Well, let's hear what you have to say, Greg.
Great. I mean, I think it's important that that the members of this committee can hear a different perspective. I mean, they've heard the presentation given by the Water Resources Department. And I guess I want to start by just briefly giving you my qualifications, so you have some reason to think you might want to listen to what I have to say. I mean, I've been working as a hydrogeologist for over 30 years. I've been doing water rights consulting during the last 20 of those years. Served on the Rules Advisory Committee for these rules actively. Also served on GWAC. I was on GWAC from 2005 to 2011 and served as the committee chair in my second term. I want to make sure everybody kind of understands this is a big deal. These rule changes represent the most sweeping and consequential changes to water law in decades. It seems the rules are driven in large part by the perception that the entire state is like the Harney Basin. But there are still many areas in Oregon where groundwater levels are not declining, but are showing this dynamically stable trend indicative of stable aquifers. I mean, I'm not advocating at all for over allocating groundwater, and I agree with what Phil said. I think that we do need to make some changes to the rules. But if you believe that there are areas where we can still develop new groundwater uses without negatively impacting surface water sources, you need to understand that these rules will not allow that. The rules that address substantial interference with surface water amount to basically a rubber stamp denial process for the vast majority of new applications without really being able to account for site-specific hydrogeologic complexities. Consequently, the entire review process under the proposed new rules is reduced to basically a rubber stamp denial process, or essentially a moratorium on new groundwater permits. I mean, I could go on and on and on about all the reasons for the statements that I'm making. We don't have time for all of that. But basically what we have here, this is not simply changes that are going to mean that the department will be issuing fewer groundwater permits. The department will be issuing practically no groundwater permits. And that's going to have, I think, a huge impact on our agricultural economy. And don't just listen to what I'm saying. If you look at the comments that were submitted by, I think the vast majority of the ag sector members of the RAC, they all had similar comments, and all of us, or most of us, representing the ag sector, are calling for basically a delay or a halt. Kind of a step back in this process. I think we need to spend more time working on substantial interference with surface water, on that portion of it. It's a very important part of the rules. The department spent a great deal of time, and I think to their credit, coming up with a good, rigorous process for evaluating water level data. I would like to see the same amount of rigor and scientific thought put into evaluating the potential for substantial interference with surface water. That's basically, my position. And again, I don't think I'm the only one that feels this way. I think that's something that we need to give some serious thought to. Thank you. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to provide my perspective on this, Phil.
I agree with a lot with what Greg has to say there, as far as like he said, whether it's rubber stamp or you know, blanket the whole entire state over some individual places that have the problem. I think there'd be a lot of benefit to looking farther into it as far as that goes, because it could really you know, halt or make people go backwards with a lot of development that could be you know, with the thought of sustainability of the resource in mind.
Yeah, I would also follow up and say the same thing. You know, I think we all understand the need for conservation of water. You know, especially in areas on the east side, like Klamath County or out in Harney County. We know where there's those issues, but it is tough to just blanket an entire a regulation over all areas, I think, without a lot of good data. Of course, it seems like that's something that we can't wait a long time to collect. But I'd like to see a little more information really before I give a whole lot of input in this as well.
Just putting out a pitch, you know, if folks want more information, all of these meetings have been recorded. There's been multiple public outreach events available that many of which have also been recorded. So there's a lot of opportunities to get the information that I think you're looking for related to statewide trends and well declines and the amount of data used and all that good stuff. So just strongly encourage that, you know, you check out what's out there.
That, you know, I know we haven't, have we heard from everybody on the committee at this point? I'm not sure we have. 5 of us. You know, and you know, given the group we have and different interests, I'm not surprised a bit at the fact that there's a couple of different perspectives on this. You know, and it wasn't. I have to rebut, I think, one thing that I heard from Greg. I don't think I shared the understanding that this somehow created a blanket rubber stamp denial of a new permit. You know, it was conditioned in my understanding. And Justin, if I'm phrasing this incorrectly, please jump in. Where there's substantial interference, and if water is available for appropriation in the stream that is in hydraulic continuity with the groundwater, then it wouldn't necessarily deny a permit. So it's not that there's a rubber stamp created where all groundwater permits are denied. It would be based on whether there's hydraulic continuity with nearby surface water, which is granted most cases, and then whether there was surface water available for additional appropriation in the affected streams. And so while that certainly does create a pretty broad, you know, category, I mean, in most areas, I think, you know, both those conditions would exist where water is not necessarily available and hydraulic continuity exists. That is a big impact and covers a lot of the state. I'm not trying to minimize. You know, from my perspective, I don't think it's a minimal impact. I don't think it's inconsequential. I think it's a big deal. I agree on that. But yeah, I don't see it as creating a rubber stamp denial in all situations. People mention the fact that the state is not uniform and conditions vary. And I saw the potential in the way this was constructed to address that. So, but how would people feel moving forward with advice to the commission. Seems like it might be important to capture everybody's perspective in the comments, and not, you know, the committee is not of uniform opinion on the rule changes, and I don't think that advice to the commission could necessarily rely on a uniform opinion. So the question is how to capture everybody's thoughts. How best do that? Think we could do that today, and working through it real time with Justin? Do people want some more time to visit the information? I mean, we heard a couple times that people wanted more information, and Zach pointed out that information is available. And so if people wanted more time to do a little bit of research and coalesce their thoughts, then that would point to a separate meeting between now and the end of May. What do you guys think?
I'd be fine with an additional meeting.
I think we need one. I think we're running out of time today to come up with a meaningful paper to send to the commission.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that would be best. Given where we are, I think that would make sure that everybody is well represented and heard.
Okay, that sounds good. I will volunteer to send out what I'll propose to do is send out one of these electronic polling emails that just says when's your best time, give a number of options. Sounded like Richard was proposing closer to the end of May, give folks lots of time, so that's what I'd shoot for, seeing some nods. Anything else you want me to take into account? Are there times when people absolutely aren't available that I should just avoid off the front?
Did you say a moment ago, Justin, did you say end of May?
Mid-May, before the end of May.
Yeah, I'm not available late May, but mid-May I am available. Mid-month.
Great. All right, so in that case, I will follow up again with that online poll for when folks are available. I will include in that kind of repost the links to the existing information, and we've got some one-page summary sheets and frequently asked questions. I'll make sure that I call those out specifically, and I'll work with Laura to make sure we get out kind of the key items, but everything's there in the record. If you have questions about something in particular, let me know and I'll try and point you to the right spot, because there is a lot available, and so I can help out with that. I guess your fellow committee members, Zach, Phil, were on the rec, so they may be points of contact as well for that. Anything else that committee folks would like me to do before mid-May? And I'm not gonna plan to have any presentation ahead of time. If you guys have questions that you would like me to address, why don't you let me know, and we can have that discussion period, but I'll plan on the agenda essentially being discussion amongst the committee to hash out some wording for the commission to submit as the formal public comment.
Yeah.
All right. That sounds
good. We're
good.
about out of time. We're about out of time, and but I want to make sure that there's room for additional public comments should there be any at this point. That's agenda item H. Well, if none, we can move to adjourn.
So move.
All right. Look at that, 11:59. Very good. Appreciate everybody's time on the committee, Greg, your time, and other members of the public and other groups that sat with us. Thank you very much. And we will get another meeting set up for mid-May, and that'll go out on the normal public meetings channels that I assume everybody heard about this on in the first place. So it'll be posted, so stay tuned.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Right.